Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. On today's episode, what I know, and maybe more importantly, what I don't know. We talk about the concept of how do we need to frame a mindset, maybe a bit of a growth mindset, if you will, toward making it possible to change our experience around athletics and, of course, probably other things, because much of what's true athletically is true of life. And we connect this concept to, the idea of looking at a long run. What is the purpose of long, specific endurance, if any? Let's get into today's episode. What I know is probably not as important as what I don't know. In my job as a teacher, something I share is this concept with the students that the irony of knowledge, the essential irony of learning anything, is we don't know if something is valuable until we've already learned it. And it's only at that point that we can find out if we wasted our time. But more and more I've come to believe that learning anything is not a waste of time, because we don't know what new questions the failure of an understanding that we build up to, we recognize its value, we try to apply it, and then we realize that value that we thought we had finally gotten because we finally made an understanding is null. And then we have sort of eliminated something, and then this is moving us towards better understandings. And we might think of this as opportunity cost of understanding, where we're able to eliminate, cut back down on the sort of A value, if you will, of the things that we don't understand, the things that don't make any particular kind of sense, but the things that we sort of pursue right forward. Whereas a lot of times, if we don't get to the point of actual competence, and full knowledge of what we're trying to recognize and make sense of, we can't actually understand whether or not it has any value. And I see this, I feel all the time with things that people do, and sports and athletics is one area in which this is very pronounced, because of the way our sense of competence can be enforced by areas that don't have anything to do with knowledge and understanding. And so people will continue to apply something because they, believe that it is true and valuable. They believe it, right? They don't understand it. They believe it. And, belief and faith and stuff like that. I'm not talking about this in a cultural anthropological context, but in a pragmatic realist perspective, like, that's not valuable. For example, you hear athletes like to regurgitate this concept of belief. And as sort of more and more amateurs get into their own space of sharing my journey, quote unquote, we see more and more of kind of this, like, people, right, trying to lay claim to that experience of, I too have, gained the power of belief and I applied this, right? Like it's some sort of magic. And, I don't know how anthropologically valid this thing is, but something that people like to say in popular culture is this trope that, magic is just something that we ascribe to things that we don't understand. And I don't think that that's really a valid interpretation of like the concept of magic in, contemporary and historic cultures around the world. But I do think that a lot of us basically functionally pursue our choices about training and strategy in a magical sense, and that we just sort of believe that a point has value and so we pursue it. So like VO2 max, right, which relates to this belief that the limiting factor for performance is identifying some particular kind of a ceiling, and that we need to go and we need to do practices that are associated with that. But a friend of mine, Caleb McVeigh, sent me this interesting meta-analysis, that he came across the other day, where the authors had tried to review a bunch of research, and they wanted to try to say, well, what if we look at the meta-analysis, what seems to be the impact of exercise over MMSS, so maximum metabolic steady state, which in my interpretation from the article is they were equating that to lactate threshold 1. Now, I don't believe there's a lactate threshold 1 because that implies there's a lactate threshold 2, but I try to sometimes refer to what I think of as lactate threshold as lactate threshold 1, and that's not an endorsement of the second lactate threshold being a valid thing. It's because I want to help other people who probably do feel that that's a thing or are unclear on the fact that I don't think these aren't the same. I want to help people better access what I'm trying to talk about. So in this meta-analysis, which, I think it's limited by the limitations of the studies, that the meta-analysis is based on. But the analysis of the studies said that basically, the only measured impact of training over MMSS or LT1 versus doing training under it is its impact on a marginal improvement in VO2 max. So, and a lot of people get really excited about VO2 max, but VO2 max is not a predictor of performance. Now, we could add an event where we go and we test people's VO2 max, and this would be relevant. But I think what's interesting is a lot of people believe in VO2 max as this explainer, and I think a lot of us want an explainer that is easy and is out there and is empirical, that can help us understand why are some people so much better than other people at this stuff when we imagine we're all training in the same way. And now, if you've been a dutiful follower of Black Cats Run, you maybe have gotten to the understanding that this idea that we're all basically doing the same thing is absolutely ludicrous, and that that's a total mirage, that we are doing vastly different things from other people when we train. And a part of that is because of a lack of understanding of what's going on and what we should be doing. But so with VO2 max, right, if you believe in the concept of VO2 max, well, then you're going to try to do these so-called VO2 max intensity workouts. Now, the vast majority of people who believe that they're doing a workout that's a VO2 max workout has never had their VO2 max tested, okay? And I'm going to explain why it's probably doesn't matter if you do anyway. So there's plenty of people who go out and do very well and, don't have, 80 to 90 something, VO2 maxes. So when they test people, there's a progressive exercise test, and you're supposed to reach a point where as you continue to increase exercise intensity, your oxygen uptake or consumption, right, basically your VO2 max is now steady. So, but, it's only 48% of people, based on some writing from Steve Magnus's blog, only 48% of people, he's saying, have actually even exhibited that point of plateau, whereas most people are, when they stop, there was no plateau. It had been going up and up and up, and it had gone, the oxygen, utilization or uptake or whatever we want to call it, had increased again at the step that they stopped at. So let's take that, right? So that's like basically, we can be simpler, and we can say basically you flip a coin, and that's about the probability that somebody's going to exhibit a VO2 max. The other thing that's interesting about that is, well, if you can get a plateau, then that means that people have to be able to continue to increase exercise intensity, right? So VO2 max can't be the quote unquote absolute ceiling, because if it was the absolute ceiling, then like you would try to increase exercise intensity and people wouldn't be able to increase that, right? So, but again, like I think that when we look at VO2 max, right, if we're willing to take into our mind the possibility that it's not legitimate, then these arguments are just become sort of pointless and esoteric. Whereas lactate, threshold, everybody has a point at which an additional increased intensity will lead to a marked increase in blood lactate concentration, and any further increases of intensity beyond that point will see further increases in blood lactate concentration. 100% of people exhibit this. So here's something that everybody can exhibit, and then VO2 max is something that half of people will exhibit. It's also clearly overwhelmingly the case that the more blood lactate concentration we have, the more likely we are to reach time terminus of exercise much more quickly. That is 100% validated, right? Whereas it is not 100% validated that the finishing order of endurance or aerobically driven sports is modeled by VO2 max. And that's not, and nor is it modeled by like, oh, well, then you have the variability of tactics and racing. It's just when people straight up are out there throwing down, it's not that the athlete with the superior VO2 max is always, going to win, right? I mean, on the one hand, right, on a graded exercise test, like I guess, your ability to like go further up the test, right, if you will, is probably going to be also indicative of further fitness, right? So that's the thing, is where, this VO2 max construct is probably associative, more, as much as maybe more than it is causal. And, when we look at this kind of stuff, this is an aspect of where we need to be willing to make changes, right? And one of those changes I propose is looking at endurance sports as something that really needs to be deeply understood in order to do it correctly. And it's not good enough even to have a coach who's really on the money with it, and just sort of take their prescriptive, like people who are just like, oh yeah, just send it to they turn on their Garmin, right? Their bike computer, for example, and then they just go out for the ride and they just mindlessly do what it says. They don't understand why, but they've just like gotten to the point in their athletic experience where I guess things have usually gone well enough for them that there's like, well, okay, I just go and I do this, and then I move on with my day and I forget about it. And that's fine, right? People are entitled to have that approach. But if we're looking at this from the perspective of asking the question, what's the most we can get out of ourselves, then that's different. So when you do a VO2 max workout, right, you're doing that because you believe that it has value, but you don't really have a deep understanding of VO2 max. I, also went through the phase, at one point, where I was getting into these activities and wanted to learn about them. And it was like anything I read, I just like uncritically like accepted it as true. And, the fact that originally it was difficult for me to understand, I think somehow I, used to take that as kind of evidence of, well, the complexity of this idea or the inaccessibility of this idea to my level of understanding right now, somehow, well, this must have validity to it. And I don't think that was a conscious thing, right? But that was confirmation bias that things seem or present as, scientific and studied and, difficult to comprehend. Well, that must be legitimate, right? But that's idiotic. And, to get better, right? Like, I think what we need to recognize is that we need to be willing to make changes, right? We need to be willing to say, okay, in aggregate, I've done a lot of VO2 max training. I've done a lot of these things. Have I really gotten better? Okay. And, these challenges are different for different people because, our lifestyle choices, in terms of like, how do we organize our time? Do we organize our time? What drives our level of interest in sport? Do we try to like keep ourselves, close to socially, environmentally with the things that drive that interest? Or do we, like, I know a lot of people I feel whom, they're really environmentally dependent and socially dependent on certain relationships and, certain places. And then when they're in those spaces and they're willingly and happily engaged with those, then really great things start to happen. And when they get off of that space, then it's like everything falls apart. And it's tough to watch sometimes, right? But it's just as tough to watch people like go out and torch themselves. And Strava is such an incredible window into this. But go out and watch people torch themselves in training sessions and get no better. I know, and I think a lot of us listening probably know that there's an argument that sport's really not that important, and that's sort of one of these things that I think is used as kind of the silencing effect towards those of us who are dissatisfied with this stuff, or those of us who want to like ask these kinds of questions. Is it's like people don't want to listen to these kinds of questions. I think there are plenty of people who've gotten to levels of success without ever asking questions themselves, and so to them that's not important. To them they're more inclined to maybe see people who are not performing at their level as asking questions as just people whining and making excuses. I don't agree with that. I think people asking questions and trying to figure out what's going on, what's limiting them, I don't think that's a bad thing. But I do get that, sport is not at the same time, not the be all end all. But let's set aside the conversation about what the continuous pursuit of socially constructed value attainments means and whether or not trying to be a good athlete is some sort of feudal kind of indulgent post-materialism. I think if we stay in the space of this is valuable, I think we can have a more interesting conversation. And, frankly, I doubt that anybody listening to the podcast, any of you listeners are really probably on the fence about whether or not sport is important, right? Considering that this whole podcast is very like deep dive approach, maybe beyond deep dive. Maybe this podcast is abyssal, if you will, into this stuff, right? So I don't think that this is sort of a space that's, trending among the sort of, wading pool level of interest. So, what I suggest then is that what we really need to be thinking about is we need to be thinking about finding a system or systems of validation to determine our best strategies, and that trying to like ask ourselves, okay, what are the things I do? And that's what I want. Here's a tangible thing you can try is you can take out a piece of paper, open up your notes app or a Word document or a Google Doc, and just write down a list of everything that you think you do, right? Related to exercise in terms of training practices, things unrelated to that. Write down the things that sort of compete with that. Can you think of things that, limit or seem to make your ability to engage with what you're trying to engage with more challenging? Can you think of things that, are positive and more constructive? And then what we want to do is then go through this list and ask ourselves, okay, how do I know this is having the effect that I think it is? Or, right, what are those effects? So you could take these things and divide it into a red column and a blue column, right? And one column should be the column of stuff that is effective and impactful. And another column should be the column of stuff that you think is like limiting or constraining. How do you know those things that are impactful are impactful? How do you know that those things are limiting or constraining are constraining? A lot of times professional athletes, right, will migrate, and amateur athletes too, will migrate from coach to coach. And I think that's perfectly 100% fine. I think it's, not only good to be able to do that, but I think it's perfectly fine and normal to do that as you go. I mean, my point of view is that I think we should be really aspiring to get to the point of quote unquote self-coached, where, we may continue to choose to talk to people, but we want to be a consultant, and that's what I frankly enjoy doing more than just trying to like dictate to people, do this, do that. And they're like, oh, okay, but they don't really know why they're doing it. Talking to people, trying to like, empower that, right? And if then what I'm doing is actually valuable, then, and people are genuinely value what they're trying to do, the combinations of those things mean people will continue to come back to that space of engagement and interaction because they recognize the value of that. But a lot of times our value determinations about training are based on, this thing is blank, right? So like, VO2 max workouts, those make you fast. Okay. Well, how do you know that? Because you heard that somewhere, because, people post about it, because you can find people on YouTube saying stuff. Well, take the time and try to start learning about that. If you really engaged with this podcast throughout the last year, I think that or I guess maybe I'm saying more so what I hope is the case. And if so, what I hope is the case is that you're starting to recognize and ask questions about a lot of this stuff that's going on around you in these spaces. An example of this, and I would refer you to our Instagram page at Black Cats Run if you really want to be able to see this. But I had, watched some of Lionel Sanders' I guess like lactate testing type stuff. And he had done a couple videos. I think this stuff is really interesting, and I think it's awesome that people are willing to share this. And my perspective on this is one of the reasons why I think this is great, right? I hope the people who share this stuff feel this way too, right? But that we're participating in this conversation, right? And then we bring in and we apply our perspectives. And it's possible, right? It's certainly within the realm of possibility that every idea we talk about in this podcast could be totally wrong, right? But the reality is our understandings don't advance unless we're willing to ask questions. So he had talked about doing this thing where he was looking at this Dmax value, which is sort of finding the point of an exponential curve that is like furthest away from a straight line drawn from, the starting point to the end point of the curve. And that's just a mathematical thing. There's no physiological significance to that. But, he said he was going to use this to identify lactate threshold. And I think that's where, that's a great example of, well, let's ask the question. And that's what I did. I said, what is this? And I looked it up and I said, okay, so this can't be threshold because this is arbitrary, right? This is being defined. It's not arbitrary in the sense of the math is not being done arbitrary. The math is calculated, but the connection between the math and physiological threshold is arbitrary, right? We don't identify threshold based on the mathematical definition of a exponential, a constant relationship of I'm saying this 5 times wrong, a nonlinear constant relationship, right? Which is, an exponential growth. That's not how we determine that. We determine threshold by saying we've turned from the point at which we do not accumulate lactate to the point at which we do accumulate lactate. That is a threshold because on both sides of that, there is a definably different thing actually happening. But if you take a look at our Instagram where I posted these, I did 2 things. The first thing I did is I took, the 3-zone, the polarized thing, Steven Seiler, 80-20 training, that stuff. And I said, well, what would be those interpretations, right? That's the LT1, LT2 model, basically, or at least that's what that has essentially become for a lot of people. And I first went in and did that. And you see that the Dmax value doesn't identify that, right? For the swim, for the bike, I think there were 2 different interpretations. And then for the run. And then for fun, for me anyway, I went and I said, well, this is how I would interpret this, right? This is the Black Cats Run, the BCR interpretation of this. And, for my interpretation, the lactate threshold identified by Dmax is way off. And this has two problems. One problem is that if you're training on that intensity, then it's not going to work the way that you think it is, right? And then that's going to lead to the belief that threshold is not a useful or meaningful way to train. Okay, so that's a limiting factor, right? Like, we can't determine if something is valuable if we're not actually applying or testing that thing. Like, you have to try, and that's where we need a way to verify, right? To determine if what we're doing is effective or not. I think the other issue with this is we simply can't effectively improve and develop our strategy if we don't understand the nature of what we're really trying to do or achieve. So, as far as I'm concerned, the Dmax thing is totally bogus. But I don't think it's any more different than the fact that in general, people don't recognize what the lactate threshold curve is really about. And I just think that there's a really intense bias, confirmation bias, that we all want to feel like we're in better shape than we are. I mean, I tried for a while training, at a lactate level that was, maybe for most people marginally over my threshold. Not even a millimole over. And, I went along, and then I totally, at a certain point, I just absolutely fell apart. I crashed and burned for like basically 6 to 8 weeks. And it was, and when you have that kind of an experience, okay, you have to be willing to take that information in. And so, for me, what I've tried to take in is, okay, like, clearly, if I'm not sustaining my training and I'm not improving, it's not working. And if I'm getting fatigued, then the issue can't be that I'm not training hard enough, which is what a lot of us think, right? But if you think that dead legs or sore legs, if you think that's a sign that you're training well, okay, then you're going to be moved in that direction. But how do we know that's good? If you think that your fitness can accumulate quickly at a certain amount in a certain amount of time, then your inclination, your sense of when are you going to train in proximity relative to something is going to be limited by that understanding. If you think that you just train for X amount of time and you build up to a peak and then you plateau, then you're going to be concerned about ramping up your training too quickly. But that is probably a consequence of this silliness of, like, what's actually going on there is you're just training unsustainably, right? And after 2 to 3 months, you're just going to fall off the cliff physically, mentally, or both, right? But then if you believe that's the right way to train, you're going to rationalize that and you're going to try to time it differently. But the actual way to get good at this stuff is to train the right way all of the time, and not to take breaks and not to be detraining. And doing that. And the further out in advance you start working on this stuff, the better. And if people have, questions about, how do you do that? How do you sustain, a steady, march of progress in your training approach? Reach out to us and send us a message on Instagram. If there's interest for that, we can do an episode where we talk, about some, very actionable things that people can do to switch to and build into that kind of approach. But consistency over time, but you got to be consistent in doing it in the manner that's effective, and again, and that's why I say we have to identify the practices of things we do in training, but also, aspects that influence how we engage in training, right? If you have a motivation issue, which that word is used in a lot of stupid ways right now. But if we say motivation is just that, here's an example. So I went and got a haircut on Saturday and at 9. And I know for me, if I get up in the morning and I don't immediately work out, then it becomes very difficult for me to want to go and do that. I don't know exactly why. There's no good reason for that to be the case. I think maybe I just start getting into doing other things and then I'm engaged in those things and I don't want to have to stop. And so, it took me until the afternoon to go out and do my steady state run, which was fine. And I enjoyed it and I felt great and I felt so much better after doing it. But that recognizing that kind of a pattern. But I was like, okay, I don't really want to go later in the afternoon and get, the haircut, right? But it can be little things like that we think are little do have a big disruptive effect. And if we want to get to the point where we have good strategies, I think the essential quality is to start by reviewing what we already know or think we already know. In the last episode that we did, we talked about some examples of some of the 30-mile long runs that I've done and some of the experiences with that. And I think, those kinds of conversations, that kind of looking at, even your own anecdotal experiences with training, but then trying to relate that to, like, what do we know? What do we not know? What do we need to know more of? Is really important, right? Because if we take this idea of the long run, right, for runners, or right, the sport-specific equivalent for other aerobic endurance sport disciplines, our concept of that, right, is set on a group of norms, right? And we believe it's valuable, so we do it. And we hear people do it on Sunday, so we do it on Sunday. But the implementation and its benefit, right, are directly related to each other. And then, tying that together is what is this actually doing, right? What is it that we're doing here? And if we don't really understand what's happening as we're doing it, then our ability to know that we're doing it, even if we are maybe doing it optimally, we don't know that, right? Unless we know what we're doing. That this anti-knowing thing, and this idea of, for goodness sake, Nike has a whole multi-billion-dollar marketing scheme based on the just do it thing, right? That's a huge part of sports culture and sporting culture and, American go-get-itness, whatever obnoxious stuff you want to think about down that rabbit hole. But I really think that asking questions is important, and challenging ourselves is important, and having a social space or a social community with people in these sports where you challenge and are challenged is important, but that also can feel very threatening to people. And I understand that, but the value for that is huge. And I think we have to be willing to challenge ourselves first, challenge ourselves to be willing to be challenged, challenge ourselves to be willing to go and have people, ask questions. I am continually, honestly amazed. I always, feel that well, there's not going to be anything to talk about on this podcast anymore. And then there's just new ideas because the experience of this stuff is so vast. And I really think that our understanding of sports, performance, right, in terms of not just sports science, but all aspects that go into that, I feel like it's just basically infantile. We're so low down the path of understanding that, we're never going to run out of things to consider or discuss. Yeah, I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a comment from Peter Coe. And I used to be, pretty dismissive of the Peter Coe, Seb Coe thing, because I felt that it was I saw it through this lens of, okay, well, this is just this whole thing to say that you don't need to train very much. And I felt, and this is true, I think, evidently true through all of the, information that's out there. I felt that you needed to be able to train a lot. And I felt that I was being screwed because I kept going to these environments where the norm was to not train very much, and or hand and foot with that is to then work out extremely hard and extremely intensively, and I felt I never really got the opportunity to actually get in shape. I think my leg muscles were very strong, but it was irrelevant. And I see people who have more aerobic fitness than me, then be like, oh, well, I'm going to do these strength things. And my attitude is kind of there's no point to that. And I did a whole episode, I think it was called The Speed Merchant, where I talked about, where I think the speed actually comes from and how that's actually developed. So I'm not going to go into that here. But, people, right, again, they start to get to the point where they go outside of understanding and they just say, oh, you do this thing, this is a fast thing. I want to be fast, so I'm going to start doing this fast thing. And they're not really asking questions. But, the Peter Coe thing, he had some comment where he basically something effective don't do stuff unless you know why you're doing it. And that used to aggravate me because I thought it was this whole idea of don't do, if you're not, don't just go out for a run, because that's not specific, right? You have to do these specific workouts. Everything has to be workouts. And it's like, well, I'm not getting any better doing these workouts. So I think this is a bunch of bullshit. And maybe that's actually what he meant, right? Maybe that really was the case. But I've now started to think about that differently. And maybe I should give him more credit. Maybe he meant something a little bit more expansive, which is just that the idea that if we don't understand why we're trying to do something, in other words, we don't understand what we think we're going to accomplish or get out of doing something, then there's a very good chance that we're just wasting our time and we're doing something incorrectly. Like the idea of long run, go for a long run. There's so many different ways that people will do that. The idea of go out and run these quote unquote VO2 max intervals. There's so many different ways that people will do that. I did these episodes where we talked red light, red, yellow, green. We talked about the idea that different athletes are, we learn formatively what exercise means in terms of perceived exertion experiences like rec sports, right? Club sports, school sports, gym class, right? And, there's this whitewashing effect that goes on, that you go out and you do some conditioning and the coach says that's good, but everybody was not doing the same level of exertion, right? And so there's no conversations about how it should feel. And this is something I've always tried to do with people that I've coached. And the people that I've been able to work with successfully are people who they like having those conversations. And the people who just like it's like trying to catch sunlight in a bottle. These people who just will not, they're so evasive. And you just, at a certain point, you just give up. It's like they don't even know that there's value to be had here, right? And they're just, everything they're doing to just get out of it and not get out of having these conversations. And it's like, fine, you don't have to if you don't want to, right? But they don't see the value there. They're not willing to try to hear a reason as to why it might be valuable. And, those, and then there are people who are like that, who are going to be good at this stuff. And then we look to those people in some cases worshipfully, like, oh, tell us your secrets. What is the magic? That's the whole problem. There is no magic to this stuff. The secret is there is no secret. And I think a great example of this is the paradigm shift that I've had over the last, maybe a little more than a year, let's say 14 months in particular, around lactate. And for me, this really began with, seeing some stuff on YouTube with the Norwegian triathlon guys, Gustav and Christian. And then, I decided, by pure happenstance, I guess maybe I'll watch this Kona race and see what happens. And I was really impressed, as I think, to be fair, like everybody was, with those two guys and, how they did in that race. And so for me, this is like, well, I'm curious to know about this, right? This idea of using this lactate stuff sounds very different. How are they using this, right? And that's just my idea of, natural curiosity, I guess, right? And I think wanting to figure that out is something that, is very driving and motivating for me at times. I would say, if I'm being reflective, that probably 90 to 95% of these understandings I didn't have 14 months ago. And I think if I'm being honest, I would say there are things that I've done in coaching, and I've talked, very freely about, my inability personally to try to be mindful and apply these same pearls of wisdom to myself, because my anxiety of I'm not doing enough, I'm not training hard enough to get better is very deeply rooted, but that it's easy for me to sort of put limitations or see the value of limitations, when talking to other people or when coaching other people. But, I think there are things that I've done in those contexts that have been very good or very similar, but I also see now how, wow, I should have taken that further. And I probably was ascribing a potential value to this thing that maybe wasn't really there. And I think it's like actually very confidence-inducing. It's just absolutely awesome to continue to find that you can, learn things, because it means that like the answers to these training questions, right, to these questions of performance, if you will, are really still out there. And it's why I enjoy taking the time to record this podcast because there's always things to make better sense of. So this is a review of what I feel I know about lactate now. And I tried to sort of package all the stuff that has been explored, over the course of, the first 55, 60 hours or so of this podcast into one sort of narrative. So lactate is a source of energy. When we are efficient, lactate is low. When we are efficient and increase work, lactate remains low. When we are inefficient, lactate is high. And the more inefficient we are, the higher the lactate is. Now, energy is finite, right? Entropy, right, is a thing. Like we are not a perpetual motion machine. So because energy is finite, all resources are limited, we take efficiency to mean that we can go for a long time, and we take inefficiency to mean we can go for a short time. If efficiency sees low lactate until, right, lactate increases in concentration, then lactate production is increasing across in exercise intensity. So what I mean by this is every time we increase the amount of work that we do, the metabolite that the body is increasing in availability is lactate. And we know from George Brooks and lactate shuttle hypothesis that lactate is being produced and moved, right? And it's being made available. And that the reason that this is happening, right, is that we're consuming it. And then we can't see it accumulate until we get to the point where we're running out of the ability to consume it. Because if lactate was something that was a byproduct, then it should just constantly be accumulating across exercise. Now, one of the issues is a lot of the people who go to test lactate and do a threshold test are not willing, it's insane to me. People will not start at a lower intensity, right? Because we're so needful to feel that we're better than we are, right? And this confirmation bias of, maybe my lactate threshold is 2 or 2.5 or 3. Well, for Marius Bakken, right, he was shifting from this sort of 4 millimole paradigm down to something more moderate, right? So competition is competition. It is comparative. It is relative, right? So he moved to a more optimal strategy relative to the intensity a lot of other people were working at. But that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have gone further in moderating that intensity. So the body, right, is producing this as a benefit to us, right? And the body would not produce more of an energy source precisely at the point where it cannot utilize it. So if lactate's a metabolite, let's just sort of only start producing this at the point at which we can't make use of it anymore. That doesn't make any sense, okay, when we understand that lactate is a source of energy. So therefore, lactate is produced proportionally to work demand, not proportional to capacity for utilization. And I think that probably makes sense from the perspective of evolutionary biology, that a organism that's more likely to survive is going to be an organism that makes energy available. And then it's also the case that when it's available, when you reduce exercise intensity, it may also be more efficient. And my paradigm is that efficiency needs to be a central explainer for anything the body does, because more efficient organisms are going to be naturally selected for. And evolution has been going on for 4 billion years. That is a mind-numbingly large number of years, okay? That's going to lead to some pretty efficient organisms, right, evolving over time, okay? And, humans are a very complex organism, right? We look at the capacity of our cognitive function, right? It, behooves us to be energy efficient in particular. And So like that's why we're producing lactate in that manner, right? I think is that because then when we reduce exercise intensity, the blood lactate goes down, and people have measured that if you come to a stop, your blood lactate level declines more slowly than if you jog very easily. Why? Because when you come to a complete stop, there's not a demand for that lactate that has accumulated, right? But if you jog very slowly, now you're doing that at a level where you're not exceeding the capacity of the mitochondrial reticulum. So now you're just going to consume the lactate that's already there, right? And it doesn't come down as fast when you're standing there because there's not as much of a need to use it as a metabolite. See, like all of this stuff makes sense, right? All these relationships can be understood when we recognize that it's a metabolite, it's an energy source. In other words, right, the mitochondrial reticulum's epigenetic state, its epigenetic capacity, does not determine the amount of lactate produced. So it's not like, oh, you have a bigger mitochondrial reticulum, so to speak, then you have more lactate being produced. I don't think that makes sense. And so since lactate accumulation occurs after crossing from a state of efficiency, which is, making use of available energy, to inefficiency, which is non-use of that available energy, then there can't be any secondary lactate threshold. So there's no second threshold. If there was a second lactate threshold, there should be a second point in which something changes. But that doesn't make any sense, right? There can only be one, factor to this based on what we actually know, which is that there's a point at which the lactate accumulates because your body is producing it proportional to the work you're demanding it to do, but that you've exceeded the capacity, to do that, right? And maybe it's also the case that, the other muscle fibers, so-called fast twitch fibers, when those are being engaged, they just don't have the same mitochondrial infrastructure, right? So maybe that's a factor to consider too that we'll come back to. And I think after the lactate threshold is passed, lactate is accumulating, what we say exponentially, right? That's sort of what those curves look like, although there's no one singular every single time, this is the curve, this is the exact function of that curve. But, all those curves, if we describe them as exponential, remember that an exponential function is a nonlinear constant relationship. So saying the line is steep here is a kind of optical illusion. So it's a fallacy to think that the significance of lactate threshold is relative to a second lactate threshold, because it doesn't exist. And if you're going to use that as a concept, then you're going to reach erroneous conclusions about why you are in shape, why you're not in shape, about how you should or shouldn't be training, right? What's your limiter, right? You're going to redistribute your concept of time and intensity in ways that are ineffective. When we think about changes in lactate, we have to rationalize it against the following principles. Number one, when lactate is lower, it correlates to longer time till failure. Lower lactate means that you're more efficient, therefore, right? And greater efficiency means that it is greater level of ease. So lactate changes are reflecting metabolic changes, right? And a lactate threshold change has to be some sort of a change in a kind of a metabolic capacity sense, then at least to some degree. And that number 5, right? Evolution tells us the body will always try to seek the most efficient means. So we need to be interpreting this stuff from the perspective of efficiency instead of being like, wow, look at this crazy waste product. Okay. Organisms do not survive if they just take and just produce massive amounts of waste. That's just not an efficient organism that has a high probability of surviving. So the development of the mitochondrial reticulum is key because metabolic capacity to use more lactate is determined by the mitochondrial reticulum. And the developments of the mitochondrial reticulum, right, in terms of developing into a more substantial system, is an epigenetic response to subthreshold utilization of muscle fibers. Okay, and I think a big part of that is the case that when we work way over threshold, then we're getting so tired so quickly that we just aren't really inducing the kind of systemic homeostatic buzz. We aren't really getting in that zone of proximal epigenetic response, right? It's just not enough of a stress for the body to want to then waste its energy. Oh, we exercised and we breathed hard for 90 seconds 8 times. That's not going to make the body be like, oh crap, let's just go produce a bunch of mitochondria. That's super inefficient. There's no incentive for the body to waste its energy in that way. Okay, right? And again, that's where that principle of interpreting through the lens of efficiency is, I think, really important. So if we take this to the long run, right? This is a buddy of mine, Michael Watson, had commented to me about, well, what if you think about this idea that there's some research that says that you're fatiguing these slow twitch fibers, which are more quote unquote aerobic, and then you're going to these fast twitch fibers. So if we think about it in this way, that then led to me to this additional possibility when we think about what is the purpose of the long run or the sport-specific equivalent of the long run. In the long run, right, the slow twitch fibers are getting fatigued first, probably because those are the more efficient fibers. And right, the body's always going to seek that point of maximum efficiency when doing work. And then maybe after the slow twitch fibers are fatigued, the body is going to use less efficient fibers, the fast twitch. This means that the fast twitch fibers are now experiencing an epigenetic stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis, creating more mitochondria, right? Expanding, developing the mitochondrial reticulum in the cells of those muscle fibers. And this turn point of a switching from efficiency to less efficiency, right? Going from the slow twitch fibers more efficient to the fast twitch less aerobically efficient. I wonder, and I haven't tested this, but I wonder if you did a long run or a long specific continuous endurance session at a constant power, right? Constant watts, constant work rate. Constant velocity is not always great, because to maintain a constant velocity, unless it's the conditions are exactly identical, you're going to have variable work rate. But does there come a point where you can identify at what point the fast twitch fibers are starting to become very present? Because now there's a step up in lactate. Not that it necessarily would continue to accumulate, but we now exhibit a elevated lactate level because you're using muscle fibers with less mitochondria, which means that your ability to consume available lactate is going to change. Does that mean that when we get to that point and we're training those fast twitch fibers that we need to slow down? I mean, certainly legs getting very heavy, the impetus to slow down is really big on long runs. A lot of people hammer their long runs or their long rides. That's not probably training. That's just performing. That's showing off on Strava. I would say keep those easy, and then maybe you need to even actually be going easier. And Michael Watson had also pointed out that, would that drive in correlation with on these big 4 to 5 hour runs that I was doing, or that I've done in the past, that the reason why on a lot of those the heart rate started to go up and up and up, does that reflect that switch, right? So is there a break point of heart rate, right? At the point in which the heart rate starts to climb or jump up, right? Could we also use that to infer that there's a point? And if that's the case, right, could we then go out in the field and try to test, lactate at around that point, right? And sort of see what's happening with the, lactate metabolism as you're changing your capacity, right, as represented by, your increasing heart rate, your increased cardiac stress. So, if that's true, right, does this mean that these mitochondrial adaptations in the fast twitch fibers are going to increase the body's ability to utilize lactate at higher intensities? Okay, so that means that if you're struggling to run fast over short distances, and you feel like you're not comfortable doing races shorter than, say, maybe 3,000 meters for runners, right? Or, really short races in the pool. I know for cyclists, right, we're usually just sort of out of that. But if you think within cycling, right, if you struggle with really short climbs and stuff like that, right, is that because you actually lack mitochondrial capacity, right? That those fast twitch fibers can't take as much advantage of the available energy because they don't have as much mitochondria. And if you can improve the mitochondria in those fast twitch muscle fibers, are you going to feel more comfortable, more efficient in those faster races? So If that's true, then long runs or long specific sessions will directly lead to greater time to failure in short distances, high intensity performances, because of the improvement in mitochondrial capacity in those fast twitch fibers. So therefore, long runs make you faster over short distances or more powerful over short durations, despite the fact that you're imagined to be supra threshold, and therefore, as a lot of people then say, you're using other energy systems beyond aerobic metabolism. Now, one way we could measure this is we could say, well, do you exhibit less blood lactate accumulation running the 1,500 meters, say, right? Or doing a short, quote unquote, in cycling, I like to say explosive climb, but like explosive isn't really the right word, but just a short climb that's maybe, less than 10 minutes or maybe even less than 5 minutes, right? You exhibit a lesser accumulation of blood lactate. If that's true, should we interpret that to mean that we're changing our efficiency, right, of those fast twitch fibers? Fatigue, though, from long endurance workouts does greatly reduce speed and performance until full recovery from the workout has occurred. And this has created the misconception that long runs, long endurance workouts reduce speed and make people slow. But in point of fact, a fatigue state is what makes people slow, regardless of how the fatigue is reached. There's no such thing as like good fatigue or performance-enhancing fatigue. And I know there are some ideas out there about like cycling, doing openers. If you're a cyclist, for Pete's sake, don't do openers ever again. It is absolutely pointless. Okay, it is dumb. You're literally, let me go out and make my muscles tired. Okay, it doesn't make any sense, but that's because you're not asking the question, why am I doing this? What is the point? There is no freaking point to it. You are wasting your time, literally wasting your time and energy doing that. Okay, that is not how we improve our ability to be able to go fast, to work intensively, in 24 hours time or whatever. Even worse is when people go out and, let me do some micro intervals in the morning before my race. I mean, the fact that you can, just shows. It's like the Arthur Lydiard story about I can't remember his name, but the Frenchman who, slept in and had to rush to the track and had no time to do his usual 40 to 50 minute warm-up routine, and just did a couple strides and went out and set the world record in the 1,500. And his thought process, supposedly, the anecdote goes, was like, wow, imagine what I could have done if I'd done my usual warm-up. So then he made sure to always do his usual warm-up, and he never ran that fast again. Okay, make of that what you will, but I think that proves, references in support of what I'm trying to say. I.e., don't do fatiguing training close to performances where you want to be able to perform. Short, high-intensity workouts also fatigue the fast twitch fibers, right? To be clear, right? If you're using them, they'll get tired eventually if you do enough. But I think those workouts are just too short in duration and too intensive in demand to lead to the good epigenetic stimulus for mitochondrial biogenesis in those fibers. So I also wonder if then high volumes of training cumulatively fatigue slow twitch fibers as you go, so that there's a cumulative fatiguing effect, so that just in general, fast twitch get more of a mitochondrial stimulus. And if that's the case, maybe this isn't specific to doing the super big, defined long run or long session. I think that some of the benefit of doing the long run or the long session has to do with like aspects of muscular fatigue, and that's a different issue that I'm not trying to go into on this episode. But there's a lot of questions to be asked there. For sure. So, right, that high volume of training, right? Maybe that's another way to get the fast twitch fibers, tapped into getting more of a mitochondrial stimulus. And is that why that maybe like going from 55-minute runs to 75-minute runs could lead to a huge jump in performance, right? And just keeping those runs, very appropriately moderate, very much sub-threshold. Whereas I think for a lot of us with our running, all we've really ever done is basically gone out and done a bunch of threshold intensity training or higher on the majority of our runs. And that's one of the things that I've come to recognize is I was always basically trying to get in the groove of training at a level that was over my threshold. And so we can then ask the question, do we need a long run to always achieve the aerobic adaptation for the fast twitch that I'm hypothesizing here? How else can we get the fast twitch to work below their respective lactate threshold? Because we're also seeing, like, usually to get those muscle fibers going, we have to run faster or harder over that, right? So there's this weird endurance effect where now we're using these fibers at their own sort of sub threshold intensity in a way that it's maybe we just can't really access unless the slow twitch fibers have been sufficiently fatigued, such that we call these to engage in this aerobic way. And, I also think we know it's true that if oxygen was the limiter for all of this stuff, then, we would be specifically better. Sorry, I'm saying this incorrectly. We would not be specifically better at the sports we specifically practice. We would be proportionally good at any physical movement done aerobically if this was all about oxygen and all about VO2 max. And this is evidently not true. I don't even think this is a question, that clearly does not happen in practice, right? But that goes, I think, further to the point of, like, how is, like, the sort of aerobic capacity of sport-specific muscles and sport-specific movement, if you want to think of it in a, like, synaptic potentiation thing, how does that really function? And elite athletes, some people sometimes talk about this idea of elite athletes having their LT1 closer to an LT2. Now, I think this is bogus, as you know, because LT2, as far as I'm concerned, does not exist. You can listen to our most popular episode, Behind the Curtain, if you want to hear more on, my breakdown of why that's fake, right? So first of all, the observation that elite athletes have an LT closer to LT2 makes no sense because LT2 doesn't exist, okay? I can't be best friends with the Easter Bunny because the Easter Bunny's not real. Okay, that's why it's significant to know if something is or isn't real. Okay, it's a big limiter in our understanding if we don't establish that the Easter Bunny is not a myth. And in this case, the LT2 would imply that aerobic development is actually ultimately limited by a secondary threshold, right? And then you can only get up, your LT2 can only be so much of a percentage of your LT1 can only be so much of a percentage of LT2. So it's like, now you have to do all the high intensity stuff that, you suck at and makes you injured and never made you fast. And so, hey, I guess you're just slow because you're slow. And it's not true. It's not true. Or people can say, it's VO2 max, but again, like, it can't be VO2 max because I don't think VO2 max is really real. Right? Only 48% of people exhibit a VO2 max. 100% of people exhibit a lactate threshold 1, and there's, like, nothing that people are specifically exhibiting or is definable. Now, I know people have tried to, like, do this maximum lactate steady state thing, but, like, that's dumb. Like, you're just taking, like, yes, the relationship doesn't suggest that, like, okay, once you cross your threshold, like, if you then run that fixed intensity over threshold, your lactate will accumulate across that intensity. If you run below threshold, you're going to reach some point where your lactate is probably going to be higher than that. We've outlined a hypothesis as to why that could be the case. I'm not saying it's the best hypothesis, but it's something that's worth considering, I believe, right? So 100% of people, though, exhibit this lactate threshold effect. But people trying to use these MLSS nonsense, I just don't subscribe to that either, because it obviously makes sense that you can hold a steady lactate for a while at intensities over lactate threshold. There's nothing in lactate threshold that I think suggests or implies that would not be the case. So I don't think you can you're not proving the existence of some secondary lactate threshold by MLSS. I think that's you're just studying the fact that, oh yes, when people run over lactate threshold, but sub-maximally, their lactate will not constantly accumulate. Okay? Wow. That doesn't mean there's a secondary threshold. Anyway, though, does this mean, right, that what does it mean, right? This idea, right? What are people actually seeing when they think they're seeing LT1 being closer to LT2 in elite athletes? And this is where, right, when we ask the right questions, we get potentially different insight. So does this mean that elite athletes more rapidly develop a blood lactate concentration after they cross the threshold? Assume the above is true, then does that mean that elite athletes have greater metabolic potentiation? Since lactate scales proportional to work, that potentiation wouldn't be seen until after a lactate threshold is crossed. So can we infer that they have more power and they're stronger than us because they just have a better source of power? That would mean that elite athletes are better because they are more efficient. And, it certainly makes sense that elite athletes are probably more efficient. Or does this observation of LT1 proximity to this imaginary LT2 mean that elite athletes have a much smaller gap between their point of accumulation and their point of terminal work? The intensity at which they cannot continue to work harder. So meaning that if their lactate threshold is 1 millimole, then they're going to get to a point where they're going to be having 4 millimole, and then they're going to be toast, right? Whereas for people, here's an example. So you can watch, Lionel Sanders' treadmill test for his running test. And I have the graphs of that on the Instagram page. You can take a look at that, right? And he's running a 4:30 pace, and he's 3 or 4 millimole. I think it was 3 point something millimoles of lactate. And, that's probably because he's so close to his potential aerobic capacity as an athlete that he's running 4:30 pace, and he has, really using the lactate to do that, right? So he's able to do that, very much, quote unquote, aerobically, even though that is over threshold. It doesn't mean that he should be able to run 4:30 pace for 26 miles, but I could see an argument that somebody like Lionel Sanders could over time get to run in 4:30 pace, for 8K to 10K, something like that, right? Seems maybe more reasonable for somebody at that level to get to that point. He doesn't do those events, right? So obviously he's not just going to go step out of the car and just run 4:30 pace for 5 miles, okay? And that would probably still be pretty challenging. So, but if this is true, then does this mean that elite athletes with very high, or any athlete really, that still get to a very high level of blood lactate accumulation, if they keep taking steps beyond their threshold, is that actually a marker of capacity for potential aerobic improvement? A friend of mine, will get up to 12 millimoles of lactate, and, could probably go further. And I think this is somebody who has tremendous capacity to improve aerobically. So does the high level of blood lactate mean that, hey, look at all of this metabolic energy that you aren't able to take advantage of? This is why you aren't going as fast, right? You need to get to the point where you can take advantage of that. And the training that gets that mitochondrial adaptation, does that do that? So lactate values over threshold, that doesn't mean there's this glycolytic power thing. It doesn't mean you're more explosive. It doesn't mean you have a faster 400 because you can have a lot of lactate sitting in your body and not being used. A metabolite that you're not consuming is not the explanation for performance. That is idiotic. Okay, there's another explanation for performance. What does make sense is that, hey, you know what? You're going really intensively for 400 meters or whatever. If 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, 3 minutes, you're going really intensively, and your body is pushing out lactate, right, to proportional to the work demand, right? And then it's there and it's available. Maybe that is good, right? Maybe that helps people recover, right? That idea of having that lactate available in the blood so that when you bring it back down, you can access that. Maybe that's a good thing, right? Because then the body doesn't have to produce as much lactate. I don't know. I'm just kind of totally speculating. These aren't even, that was not a pre-planned thought. right there. Who knows? I certainly don't. But this example, right? You got to be open to asking questions as they come up. So, but that idea of like glycolytic power, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because the lactate curve isn't like a sign of like glycolytic power. It's just the fact that there's this curve and this growth is just a measure of your declining efficiency. Okay. Like the curve as a curve doesn't have any meaning, right? It's like, in cycling, people like to look at power curves and be like, oh, the shape of this power curve, my power curve doesn't mean diddly squat, because it's just a reflection of what kind of riding I've been doing, and ironically, if I go out and try to make a really strong power curve, I'm actually probably going to go out and stink it up anytime I race, because if you're doing that, you're probably not training that well, but people like to try to look for meaning under these, rocks where there really, I don't think necessarily always is something. I don't think it's bad to ask the questions, right? But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to take these understandings and say, okay, what else can we think about here? I think the only important aspect of the graph of lactate is the threshold, right? Or the onset of blood lactate accumulation. And I think that when we take this knowledge, right, and then we start trying to use this as a leverage for understanding and the different things that we're doing, I think we have significant potential to start to reevaluate what we're doing. And if we're willing to reevaluate and we're open to challenging our own thinking, if we can have that kind of a growth mindset, if you will, I think that everybody has the capacity to make some big changes in terms of what they experience. It's not about ginning yourself up. It's not about subjecting yourself to a level of torture. It's about finding ways to make it easy to do. Make the training easy, right? Make the aspect of incorporating training into your life easy, and then you're going to be successful. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes and you know other people who would find this kind of content interesting, please reach out to them. Let them know that we're here. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to share, you can message us on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run. If you'd like some consultation for your own training, you can also inquire about that there as well. We'll catch you next time.